Generative AI has the potential to be the most transformational technology ever. It could help individuals achieve superpowers and enable businesses to attain new levels of productivity. But what were the models trained on? Today, we'll be exploring GenAI's copyright problem and what it means to the product teams building the next generation of tools. Today, we're speaking with Virginie Berger, a seasoned professional in the music and tech industries. She's renowned for her expertise in music business innovation and integrating AI in music strategy and rights management. Her impressive 20-year career includes pivotal roles at Downtown Music Song Trust, Harmonia, MySpace, and Microsoft, where she played a key role in generating revenue, forging strategic alliances, and championing artists' rights. She now extends her expertise as the Chief Business Development and Rights Officer at Matchtune, where they're pioneering advanced audio fingerprinting technology based on AI algorithms to detect all types of copyright infringement, AI-driven audio modifications, voice cloning, and AI deepfakes.
Thank you so much for spending some time with us. This is such a hot topic right now. Every day that I go on a music publication or any tech journal, the question comes up: copyright, copyright, copyright. And I have a reference from an article from yesterday. Anthropic CEO Daniel Armodi was asked about a lawsuit he has. I think this one was about song lyrics, and he had a very interesting quote. It's really much more like the process of how human learns from experiences. And so our position that is sufficiently transformative, and I think the law will back this up, that is fair use. It's a very interesting perspective, but obviously if you're a musician or someone in any creative industry, it's rather troubling, isn't it?
He said that he's quite sure that data training will be, like fair use. So yes, it's also based on, training for sure. It's based on education for sure, but AI won't create anything new, because actually it takes creation to recreate something based on prior creation. But the comparison between creators, songwriters, musicians, and data is quite strange. Actually, fair use, it's about quote, comment, knowledge, education, or research. And when you have a trial, when you have a lawsuit, the judge will also look at the potential damages.
Can you explain how ownership and payouts work for music on digital streaming platforms and when used in TV commercials? So there's already a legal framework for how payouts should happen. How do they work right now?
Yeah, first, when we talk about streaming platforms, so it's what we call DSP, digital streaming platforms. So, it's Spotify, it's Apple Music, it's YouTube, it's all those digital platforms. The musicians, the artists will receive their portion through their labels or through their distributors. But at the end, the amount of stream, it's just a fraction of a cent. So we know for Spotify that Spotify pays between $0.003 and $0.0005 per stream. Is going to be divided by fractions of streams and distributed according to the total streams, and then it's going to be divided between publishers, between rights organization, between record company, and at the end, really, the musician and the songwriter will take just a very, very low, will make a very, very low income from streaming platforms.
A question, just so we have wider perspective here. If I'm a photographer and I upload something, let's say, to Getty Images, how does the payout structure work there?
It's really based on the agreement. So for the US, if I take the example of music, so for the US, for example, it's not what we call free market, which means that the streaming rate will be based on the CRB, Copyright Royalty Board, and they will decide what will be, a fair rate. So it's only based on, one, the market, or two, your agreement.
Thinking then about, there's so many different ways that this rights management happens, but bringing us back to this idea of the AI of it. Last month, OpenAI's CTO, Mira Murati, sat down with the Wall Street Journal to talk about Sora, so their text-to-video generation product, and it's really been impressing people. But she was asked point blank if Sora was trained on YouTube videos, and she said, I'm not actually sure about that, before just shutting down that conversation.
Yeah. Yes.
Were you shocked or disappointed about that? Were you expecting that kind of response?
I think we were all shocked because the video was quite viral on social media and Twitter. So maybe maybe she knows and she doesn't want to talk about. That's also maybe also the reason. But I remember that they talked about, so the journalist was very pushy and, asked question about YouTube. And so she said that they train and they use all publicly available video. And following the discussion with the CTO of OpenAI, the CEO of YouTube said that based on their terms of service, TOS, no, they can't use YouTube video to train Sora and to train their tools. So it just shows at the end that there is a lack of transparency also around data training, that we are not able to understand exactly what they are doing with their data. We know that they have a partnership with, I think it's Shutterstock, and they have a license with Shutterstock. So the question is, if they are able to pay Shutterstock, why don't they pay with with their companies?
Now, there's a lot of different legal cases trying to deal with this issue today in terms of copyright and generative AI. But is there any definitive proof that generative AI products have been illegally trained on copyrighted material?
Oh, plenty. Plenty, because we know that they did it, for example, with New York Times, because the New York Times was able, just to target some data training, kind of with Suno. It's a new generative AI music tool platform. And they're also the case with Sarah Silverman. So when you say definitive, we can't say definitive because we have no judgment on it. It's lawsuits for the moment. So we are waiting for, what the judges will say at the end. So it's more a question of evidence than, definitive judgment. The question now is, what will happen with the lawsuits that are going on now? Will they decide? Will the judges decide that it's going to be fair use or not? And from there, what will be the consequences? When I say what will be the consequences, I'm not sure that fighting for, blocking or getting money for data training is the right battle. For me, it's more now. It's too late. If I may, use the expression. It's really like, how do you say, genie out of the bottle? It's correct in English, genie. Yeah, it's more like, I'm not sure how we'll be able to stop it. So I would say that instead of fighting for data training, I mean, we must be sure that it's not considered as fair use, absolutely. But the question for me is more like tracking derivative works and making sure that we can monetize derivative works instead of trying to block, data training, because it's like, mouse and cat. It's really like, because you have data everywhere on the internet. So how can you block them? And how can you make sure that they won't use data that are, yes, publicly available according to them? Absolutely. So the question is more about derivative works and making sure that there will be a licensing framework, or there will be, something in place that will allow rights holder to get paid from the use of their works, because at the end it's going to be like fraction of a cent if we want them to pay for data training and licensing the catalogs. They won't have big MG minimum guarantee like we had, or like music industry have had with Napster, for example, or with licensing with Spotify, for example, or YouTube. So the question is really about how can we make sure that rights holders will keep track of derivative works first, and also will be able to opt in or opt out.
So right now, a lot of these legal battles that we're starting to see are really around this idea of fair use and still trying to make that copyright infringement case similar to things like Napster, or in 2015 with Google when it came to the literary world.
Yeah.
Do you think that the difference that we'll start to see soon is about this idea of moral rights, or that there'll be a shift in the way that some of these legal battles change so that they can have some impact beyond just trying to shut down those use cases?
I know that the music industry, talks a lot about Napster, but for me, it has nothing to do with Napster. Napster, it was copy and distribution. That's it. Nothing more. Now, when you look at the industry, it's like Napster, so very young guys, copy and distribution. AI, it's smartest minds of their generation, backed by billions behind them, supported by governments. Because at the end, when you are, I'm sure that when governments, because music is nothing, or creativity, creative industries, it's nothing in the AI battle. And which means that if the US government or if the European Commission has to choose between fighting against Chinese AI or Russian AI or protecting music, they won't choose music.
We're entering this era of generative music, generative film, generative literature.
Mm.
Do you think that, given that there are much bigger implications of AI in the grander scheme of things, that consumers are going to notice or care if a work is original or derivative? Do you think that
Well,
behavior will shift?
But if you think of the number of new works that will be generated by AI, and it means that the market share and the catalog of Universal Music will be diluted, which means that because when you will have millions of kind of copies of Universal Music artists, the value of the catalog will be diluted. So at the end, the IP won't be the same. So regarding your question about if consumers will care or not, I'm not sure that the connection that we had. I'm old, Gen X, and I had like that connection with the artist and connection with, because I know the name and I listen to the album and I know the music. Now young people, they discover music on TikTok or Instagram. It's very, very short. Most of the time, you don't even know the name of the artist. So I'm not sure that they have this connection with the song or the artist. And it's because based on the discussion that I had with 17 years old neighbors who told me that, yeah, but in our generation, we don't have like a song or something we can remember all together that is the flag of our generation. So regarding your question about consumers, it will depend on the consumer, and I think it will depend on really the preferences and how they listen to music. But for sure, it's going to be more and more difficult for an average consumer, someone who just listens to music on TikTok or Instagram, for example, to really see the difference between original and derivative works. So that's how could they value authenticity, for example, or how could they value human created content when they won't know if it's original works or if it's just derivative works. And at the end, will music become a utility? Like you like music, but you like music like entertainment. Like, once again, I'm on TikTok, I'm on Instagram, there is a song behind the video. Oh, that's great. But it's utility. It's not connection.
Do you have any insights as to whether people at Spotify, New York Times or Getty are fearful that their business models are going to become completely devalued? And from this perspective, let's take somebody like a Suno, right? They could become a streaming platform that's just totally generative music. What's the future look like?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And Suno so the CEO had an interview on Music Business Worldwide, and he talked about revenues around 120 billions of music because they want to democratize music. Why going on Spotify when on Suno you can listen to whatever you want and you can create whatever you want? And you can also create songs that are very, very close to original works. So I read this article about on Suno about Eminem and Rolling Stones that sound exactly like Eminem or the Rolling Stones. So it's a big question. I know that Spotify is working on. I mean, I don't know. I heard that Spotify is working on AI tools to help creation. So artwork, and first to help creators with their artworks, which is another question related to what you said about photographies. because same. I mean, if now we can create artwork without using, people and graphists, what would be the point? But Spotify is already using AI for music recommendations, for instance, and also for new artist tools like playlist and playlisting. So they're already using AI, but not like Suno. They are using AI on the B2B side, not on the B2C sides. About Getty, well, yes, because when AI now can create images or custom images, or also assist in faster image editing, it's in terms of business model. I can understand that it's a big threat for them, and that they want to make sure that their data won't be used for data training, but also to create derivative works. Because what is absolutely crazy with derivative works is that you are competing against yourself. Because as let's take the example of a musician, so the Beatles. So maybe, because I don't know, maybe Suno, is using the Beatles catalog to train Suno. So at the end, someone will be able to create music that will sound like the Beatles. So actually, the original works Beatles will compete with the derivative works Beatles, and it's going to be the same thing with photographies, with music, with images, because at the end, the creator will have to compete against themselves, because it will create exactly the same work. We know that for the New York Times, the reason also behind the lawsuit is that they fear that people won't use Google to find, articles and to look for news, which means that they will lose part of their ads revenue sharing with Google, which is a huge part of their revenues at the end, because people will go through directly with, OpenAI and get info, maybe not news, but info from OpenAI, instead of looking at Google and maybe getting a search link with New York Times.
I want to go back to something you said earlier. You brought up the term, the genie's already out of the bottle.
Yeah.
How can creatives move forward equitably if the genie is out of the bottle, if the data has already been scraped? Is there a path that you prefer? Is there a path that the industry prefers?
I won't talk about, on the behalf of the industry, because I know that, there are a lot of opportunities, but it's unfortunately, it's not unified. It's not a unified front. So I hope that soon we'll know what the industry wants to do and how they want to move forward. But based on myself and what I would like to do, well, we have some solutions. So we talked about, original works versus derivative works. And maybe here we have a path with making sure that all companies like Suno, OpenAI, and Stability, Udio, the last one, they will add an ID to each piece of derivative works, which is absolutely possible because we do it in the music industry. Each recording has what we call ISRC, or for publishing works, it's ISWC, which means that we are able to track works everywhere and be able to pay the rights holder. So we are doing it in the music industry. And so maybe to pay behind and to create a licensing framework based on those codes. It's what we are doing in the music industry. It's how we can track musical works and pay musical works. So it's maybe one step. So to make sure that we can identify derivative works. Even if someone, Andreessen Horowitz, the CEO of, the investment fund, said that maybe it's going to be easier to track original works because there are going to be, so many derivative works that it's going to be easier maybe just to track and put a code to original works, which is, well, we'll see. Also, maybe to work now on a licensing framework about derivative works. We can't ask the user, the consumer, to pay, but maybe we can work with, same platforms, AI platforms, to share royalties and rates with rights holders. It's our work Spotify, for instance. We also have to make sure that rights holder can opt in or opt out. We also have to work on the transparency. and for AI company to disclose their data training. It's what the Adam Schiff wants to do with the AI bill, and it's a very interesting bill. So that would be great. I know that AI companies are trying to lobbying and push against it, but it would be great to get it. So we have some solutions, but the thing is that when I say Jenny's out of the bottle, it's also a question of being too late, because as we are waiting, for something to happen, it's at some point. So I'm not sure that we'll be able to negotiate with those platforms, with Suno or Udio or all those platforms will be very, very big. It's also a question of power and balance of power. So I'm also afraid of the delay, and that maybe it's going to be too late.
Well, Virginie, it's a complex situation, and I hope that the news soon shows some sort of resolve, some resolution. I want to thank you so much for coming and speaking to us about this very complex topic.
What an interesting and complex conversation. So let's dig into it a little bit deeper and see what does this actually mean for people building product. Let's start with talking about the training models and how these LLMs are trained and why that ultimately is a problem when it comes to training on copyrighted information. So let's take something like ChatGPT-4. This is trained on trillions of tokens, which means it's trained on trillions of different words in multiple different combinations. What an interesting and complicated conversation. So let's dig a little bit deeper and see what does this actually mean for people who are building product. If we were to take it from the standpoint of, starting with how are these large language models being trained and what are they being trained on? So if you take something like ChatGPT-4, it's been trained on trillions of different words and combinations of those words. And, if you look at someone like OpenAI in particular, they've come out and said explicitly that it is nearly impossible to train these large language models in a way that is effective without the use of training them on copyright materials. So much as to even say, copyright content is pivotal for training because the LLM's performance on a wide range of linguistic tasks benefits significantly from using these copyrighted materials.
So if we try to simplify that down, one of the big differences between Google and these LLM models is Google's job is to scour the internet, find relevant piece of information, and organize them for you. It's not there. Google was never designed to give you answers. It was to help point you in places where you can make a decision of where those answers are. These LLMs are like looking at a Google search result, except where you have a person who's gone through the 100 top results to try to summarize it for you and have an opinion or point of view. So imagine these LLMs have been trained by digesting everything that your Google search would have found, every video, every Q&A from Quora, everything that was on Wikipedia. That's what makes them so powerful, but also what makes them so dangerous.
So one of the things that is particularly problematic when you think about not just these LLMs, but now as you start to utilize more of the tools that are being built on top of these LLMs, and Virginie kind of touched on this as well, is understanding the terms of service. Because oftentimes, once you've agreed or bought into those terms of service for those tools, you are sometimes giving up your rights, or you are signing away your rights to whatever you're training it on, or what's being produced and created through the use of that tool.
An example of that was Suno. So Suno is a new, really hypey AI music tool. But what's fascinating in the terms of service, and Brittany discovered this, is that basically anything you create in it, they train itself on it. So imagine that you're writing an essay with a tool, but every time you're writing that essay, it's learning from you. Or if your Google Mail, your Gmail was learning based off of what you wrote to somebody. There's some dangerous components to that, because imagine if you're training Google to know exactly who you are and it can connect it to personal identifying information, you're basically handing over your personal rights to that system. Obviously, that is a darker perspective, but nonetheless, that's what these terms of service are intended to guide.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about the example as well, is like you're creating an output from this tool that you're using, and you actually maybe don't own the rights to the output that you've created. So if you're creating a song, you can only license or use that song for the period of time that you have a subscription to this tool. So you effectively are bought in on like a lifelong relationship with them. But if we think also more broadly, like I remember one of the very first really publicly used examples of AI was when people started like AIifying their photos and creating these like wide range of really cool photos. But you're effectively licensing your likeness to these AIs and training them on your likeness and handing that away without people really thinking or considering about what that means.
Amazon has been constantly referred to as predatory because they will monitor what sells, which products sell heavily in their marketplace, and then create generic versions of that. It's very predatory, but unfortunately, that's what happens when you go into a closed ecosystem like that. Now, imagine if it could create like a New York Times clone that could spit out, almost identical content without having to pay the staff. That's the concern. These terms of service and obviously the advocacy groups of product users are there to protect you for that. Legally, a lot of policymakers are trying to have protections put in place, and the future looks optimistic, to be fair. It looks like there is a concern for this, and that the future likely will have more guardrails for this. Nonetheless, we're on the razor's edge right now, where it's hard to know who the good or bad players are looking into this future.
It's particularly interesting because if you look at the two sides of the coin, you have, for example, OpenAI, who are at the heart of so many of these lawsuits because they've been training their LLMs using copyrighted, but at the same time, they're starting to roll out features like a history where you can go through and you can actually pick and choose what it will remember, the length of history that you want it to remember, things like that. So they're trying to make some adjustments, but is it too little, too late? Who knows? And on the flip side of that, you have Google, who are currently at the heart of a class action lawsuit saying that not only were they training their data on, maybe copyright information, but that they've been basically scraping all of this data that they have about users through, all of this very private information through Google, through Gmail, through, all of these things, and saying that they've been training their LLMs on very personal private data without telling people, but also without giving people the option to opt out of it.
Now, when we think about what we can do about this, one of the suggestions that was brought up in the interview we just finished up was this idea of tracking attribution. That's how things are typically tracked. From one end on, in terms of music, there's like metadata that assigns who owns the rights to it, so you can always track it. On the other end, let's say when you upload music or videos onto YouTube, it's constantly analyzing it, often using machine learning tools to figure out if there's some copyright infringing components there. Those are some of the ways to do that. The risk here is because of the giant, massive wealth of information these LLMs are trained on, that it's potentially too late to go back and start tagging what's real or what's not. We start getting into these discussions of, well, is this what crypto services are intended for? And you start getting these questions of whether processing power are powerful enough to actually handle that level of additional meta information. Hard to know right now. If we pump out more content, can someone determine the difference between real or derivative or fake? But let's look forward. Let's look at what product teams can do about this. And at the core of it is that most product teams today are leveraging APIs from LLMs where you're not sure what it's training on and where the terms of service are often changing quite a bit. From a product user standpoint, you need to be careful and be aware of those terms of service. You need to be concerned and conscious that some products are learning through your use. And quite honestly, almost every product is doing this today. Maybe that's fine. Maybe that's just telemetry of the future. It's hard to know. But nonetheless, we need to know if confidential information is excluded, whether if something you upload that was confidential goes into the main bulk of training data. And you just generally need to be aware of the latest developments on those products that you're using today.
Yeah, so there was actually a study that was done about a month ago about transparency and data leakage on LLMs that found that it actually is quite easy to spot copyrighted texts, confidential data, things like that, if you know how to ask it into the LLMs.
Now, if we look at product teams and the lessons for them, it likely is going to become a bigger and bigger issue to be extremely transparent about the data use. Right now, people are caught up in the hype of using these products. They want the advantages of them. But once this becomes a saturated marketplace, and once there's a little more policy measures in place, it's likely going to be important to be extremely transparent on how that data will or will not be used. There's also a risk with any new AI product that there are going to be impacts, unintended consequences within those industries. I'm sure the developers and the founders of Suno have all the best intentions. I'm sure that they actually do want to democratize the use of music tools. I'm excited to use these products. I think there's something that's going to help creativity. It's going to help us get in touch with music. But we can be so focused on the grand benefit that we forget that for the ultimate creator, it devalues their work, it undermines the value of what they've done, and sometimes it can take away their livelihood.
So recently, a new LLM came out called Clem, where they have been the first LLM that's been certified to be entirely ethically trained when it comes to not using any copyrighted or confidential information. They are, I'm guessing, going to be one of the first in many who will start to come forward and want to be more transparent about the type of training data that they have. The other option when it comes to looking to be really closed and more ethical or more clean in the training data that you have available to you is to look at having a proprietary or closed ecosystem on top of those other LLMs.
The future likely is going to be guided by policymakers. There are mandates coming out or being drafted right now that prescribe that what your training data has to be publicly available or transparent. As a result of it, you might see competitors come online to OpenAI and Anthropic and such. And you might also see, as Brittany was mentioning, some proprietary layers that come on top of those or proprietary in-house models getting developed. Let's be realistic. The majority of product managers don't need access or don't care if your model's been trained on literary works or music or film or any of that. For most of us, we just need a tool that can process customer service requests, that can analyze weather patterns if you're in some like incident response tool. These other LLM training issues are more from a cultural perspective. They're ones that aid in the comprehension of things. And as Virginie mentioned, the genie might be out of the bottle at this point. It might be unaddressable, the issues related to it. But nonetheless, for most organizations, particularly ones in regulated industries, you're going to start looking at more closed ecosystem models, ones that you can train, ones where you can be certain that confidential information is withheld, protected, or maintained in specific servers. That likely will be the future of this. And for the rest of us, the consumer application will be run through an OpenAI or Google. It's not that much different than the way it is right now, where Meta and Google control a lot of information. And we just have to have confidence that it's not going to be used unethically.
I think one of the other considerations is also about looking at these smaller language models. So rather than relying so heavily on LLMs, is looking at uniquely trained, very narrow focused language models. We've already seen this come out quite a bit when it comes to coding and coding support, but I think there's going to be more of these smaller language models that will become appealing, especially to businesses who want to ensure that the ethics and safety of the data and the information is really adhered to.
Another way to handle this from a framework perspective is to think of the whole model of experts framework. What this means is that for most businesses, you only need a tool that's an expert in one thing. As a result, it doesn't need to be trained on much of anything. It needs to have a very closed set of inputs and a very specific type of output. Think about like an intercom or something like that, where there's a customer support portal, there's customer support questions that come in, there might be context from your website, and maybe there's like the emails going through. If your terms of service enable that, and that's a clean end-to-end transparent interaction, it can be trained on all that. And one agent can be explicitly focused on customer service requests. Another one can be focused on sales requests. Another one can be focused on maintenance issues and such. It's almost trying to replicate, and we saw this with the Devon tool, a Copilot tool that came out for coding recently, that really a lot of these tools, while built on LLMs, they're trying to be hyper-focused on specific tasks and trying to replicate how a human would do that, what their role would be, what their guiding principles would be, what the ethical standards of that person should or shouldn't be. And there was like a leaked framework that came out for OpenAI, and it took this perspective as well, where basically even their data set is being processed through this model of experts, where each section is trying to answer specific components of that question from different perspectives. And then they need to go through a filtering process and align on what the response should or shouldn't be. We saw this problem come out with the Google LLM, where it was, too woke was what the news headlines were. But in that, it likely was an imbalance across that framework of model of experts.
Yeah, and early research, especially when it comes to something like Clem, which is a great example of this model of experts, where you can have this smaller system of very niche focus, is that the data actually becomes more relevant, it becomes more successful, and the amount of bias significantly drops when you have this model of experts. You don't need as much data, so you just need higher quality data that it's being trained on in order to get better results. We're also starting to see this though with these bigger LLMs where they are creating more niche versions. So, Google just came out with Code Gemma and Recurrent Gemma being more research focused, but they're trying to create these LLM versions that are more of that model of experts as well.
And you brought up Anthropic. Now, Anthropic was broken off from other AI groups largely because they wanted to make a more ethical business. Now, that was the topic of the day a couple of years ago. And as a result of it, we had an entirely new competitive product that's now getting funded from Google and Amazon that's come out competing with OpenAI. The fact is, when the public makes a topic very important, prescient, when it gets headlines, businesses respond. And it would not be surprising if one of the main groups, whether that's Meta in the case of Llama or Anthropic, apply this as a core differentiator in their business model. So we'll see.
Yeah, and I really hope that that's true. I think Cloud is such a great example of this because they came out originally as a differentiator with their constitutional AI. And since then, I think there's been more public pressure to have more of a constitutional or an unbiased approach to other LLMs as well. And so, I really do think that if we as the public decide that it's really important to us that there's higher ethical standards, then there might be some pressure that gets put on just across the board.
Well, it was a wonderful conversation today. And while in 2024, GenAI has a copyright problem, I hope that a year from now, we can look back and say that there's been some sort of resolution to this, that there's some clarity, that businesses are setting a path forward, and that this was just a blip on the radar.